Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain. Today, the topic of our show is the evolving Russia-China alliance. Is it offering a new hope for the Middle East? Today, the guest of our show is Matthew Ehret, who is a senior geopolitical analyst. We will be discussing on the topic of China-Russia relations. Welcome to our show, Matthew. This is Zain Khan. It is a pleasure having you on Tactical Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here, Zain.
Let's get to the first question, Matthew. You've written a lot about China-Russia relations and its global impact. Tell us a little more about it and when it began.
Yeah, sure. Without going into any broad sweeping history, I think for the most immediate period of geopolitical relevance, the very important alliance that has occurred increasingly between Russia and China, really you could look at the period of the late 1990s. In the midst of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a recognition that a new economic geopolitical order was going to be needed, since there was no viability or sustainability in the Western neoliberal economic structure, which at that point had already created a bubble economy, and bubbles can only be extended for so long. And you had Primakov, the Prime Minister of Russia, you had Jiang Zemin of China, who in the late 90s, 97, 98, started forming certain institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what came to be later the G20, as well as the Russia, India, China, the RIC setup that formed as the BRIC and then the BRICS later on. But in spite of that, it sort of grew in piecemeal form with individual projects and never quite formalized as one serious program until really 2013. And at that point, this is when the famous announcement by Xi Jinping of a Belt and Road initiative was unleashed in September. And at that moment, you had an increasing recognition that this was something which was going to be the foundation for a completely new way of thinking about political economy, a way of investing, thinking long-term, and specifically thinking about win-win cooperation. And Russia, in 2015, mid-2015, signed a protocol to join the Eurasian Economic Union of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, a few others, with the Belt and Road Initiative. And that sort of redefined it from being simply a project of East-West connection that brought in all of a sudden the Arctic and other countries in the world that Russia was also doing business with. So I think that you have to take into consideration that there is a recognition that one system doesn't have the viability to maintain itself in the West, and a new system, a new alliance of sovereign nations that individually could not stand on their own in opposition to the transatlantic beast as it's become under NATO. Individually, they couldn't stand, but together, there is a coalition of powers that has a unique capability of creating a viable alternative. And I think that was recognized by the leadership, the intelligentsia of Russia, China, and now a growing number of nation states.
Matthew, I want to get to a very interesting question. How does China's new Silk Road impact Russia's Northern Development Vision? These two programs seem to be like operating on two different parts of the world.
Well, that's a good question. Vladimir Putin just 2 days ago gave a State of the Union address that I just listened to, and at the end of it, he really emphasized the importance of the Eurasian Economic Union, of Russia specifically, and the Eastern vision that he's put forth over recent years to really develop rail energy in the East and into the Arctic, and he's emphasized the importance of the Belt and Road Initiative with this project, which he has repeatedly stated he recognizes as one unified program. Up until now, again, the maritime Silk Road component, because there's a belt and a road. The belt is the maritime, the road aspect is the overland networks that China has been building. The maritime has been something which is not extended north into the Arctic until 2018, when China put forth a white paper announcing the Polar Silk Road as its policy intention. Before that, China became an observer in the Arctic Council in 2012, which increased its participation in a lot of the initiatives for oil, natural gas, which are in abundance in Russia's Arctic, as well as different transport networks as well. In the Russian policy, Putin put forth the intention to quintuple the activity, the flow of trade through the Arctic Passage, which would cut off about 10 days of transit of goods from China to, let's say, a place like Rotterdam, the port of Rotterdam. China has since built two advanced icebreakers that's already outpaced the technology of the United States in icebreaker technology, far outpaced Canada, and really sees itself as a major participant. On top of that, China has endorsed the building of major rail projects through Mongolia, which would connect into the Trans-Siberian Rail connection that brings also goods from Asia into Europe. And there are a variety of other things. The Power of Siberia liquid natural gas pipeline, China is a major stakeholder of, 30% stakeholder, which is a 3,000-mile pipeline to China from Russia, which would then bring Russia into becoming the major supplier, the primary supplier of China's energy needs, which at this point is vital for its growth policy. So, I mean, there's more to be said on that, but I think that that is just a quick intro, which would get people in the right direction in the interest of the Arctic for the Silk Road.
Matthew, I want to talk a little more about the Middle East. How does this alliance affect the potential for a stabilized Middle East? How does it affect the Middle East? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, on that point, both Russia and China are very aware that they both have talents to bring to the world, very unique talents. Russia completely transformed. You got to keep in mind in 2015, when Russia decided to enter Syria, the rules of the entire regime change game that had dominated the post 9/11 world were completely overturned. It didn't happen all at once, but I think by now people have recognized that there's a different game in town and a different way of doing things in the Middle East. The actual intention to bring to bear a serious program to end the threat of ISIS in Syria and do it with the cooperation of sovereign nation states, do it with the invitation of the Syrian government, was a breath of fresh air for a lot of Middle Eastern governments that had really started seeing themselves as playthings for Western geopolitical manipulation. China has while Russia has a capability of military intelligence, which is unparred, China's capacities rely much more on infrastructure building. They have a capacity to carry out large-scale programs very fast, very efficiently, but they can't do it where there is a high geopolitical turmoil. It's just impossible to maintain that level of low risk needed to build long-term projects. So by Russia putting out some of the major fires in Syria, and this is spread across the board, a certain climate of stability has been able to be introduced, of hope for reconstruction, which has now brought in about 17 Arab states, which have signed memoranda of understanding with China's Belt and Road Initiative. 8 major infrastructure projects, and huge infrastructure projects, have already begun amongst Arab countries. Iraq has signed just a few months ago a treaty with China to also bring the Belt and Road into Iraq. Afghanistan, there's a major push by the Chinese government to extend the China-Pakistan economic corridor into Kabul, which is vital to create an alternative to the the opium economy, which feeds the world's heroin addiction. Turkey is extremely enthusiastic about the Belt and Road as well, and it already is engaged in major transportation programs that are very much in alignment with the BRI paradigm. Erdogan has spoken many times in favor of this. So we have a very important, again, it's a partnership. Russia has certain capabilities, China has capabilities. Together they've produced miracles that individually they would not have been able to do. And so for the Middle East, I would say that there is a serious hope for long-term reconstruction and stabilization because of that, which extend also into many of the African states too. Just a quick note, I know I'm dragging on here, but Bashar al-Assad, right before the Arab Spring started raising hell in the Middle East, Bashar al-Assad had been pushing very heavily for his 5Cs vision to create a transportation energy hub uniting all of the major 5 bodies of water from the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Persian Gulf, through Syria. That also brought in Turkey, Lebanon, other countries. And he had gotten 7 major Eurasian countries to sign treaties to advance that, which was moving very quickly into realization up until 2011, which is now finally also being discussed once again now that there is hope for Syria.
Let's get to the last question. Many are reporting of the increased possibility for an economic crisis among the Western banks. Does the Eurasian Alliance offer any solutions to this problem, to this crisis?
Oh, most certainly. We already have major countries in the West, Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, have signed memoranda of understanding to join the framework of the BRI, which is increasingly not just seen as a project or a system of projects east to west, but like I said, it's a completely other way of doing things founded on different financial mechanisms. Everyone knows that China doesn't use the technique of demanding conditionalities the way the IMF and the World Bank does when they offer loans to countries for development. They actually want their investments to be used for the specific large-scale infrastructure projects. The West has been suffering now under several years of bailouts that began in 2008 to keep the major derivatives economy afloat. I mean, if you look at what's holding together the Western economic order, you have about 1.2 to 1.5 quadrillion dollars of derivatives. Keep in mind, 20 years ago, this was barely $60 trillion dollars of derivatives. Now it's 1.2 to 1.5 quadrillion dollars of fictitious capital. These are insurance on debts, on bets that have no real connection to the physical, real economy where real wealth and value is derived. And in fact, where we find real value, the productive powers, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, this has been collapsing at an accelerating rate for over 40 years in the West. China is doing the opposite. They're recognizing real value, real investment has to be tied to tangible outcomes, measurable increases of productivity by investments in science, technology, infrastructure, and beyond. So it's even though money is used in the two systems, the West is suffering a major blowout in its immediate horizon. It can only be pushed into the future a little bit more, but it's very precarious. And if there was not the Belt and Road Initiative and the growing, 150 countries are now participating directly into that. If that didn't exist, there would be no alternative were that blowout to happen. Because it does exist, it does provide something which I think would be seen as a life raft, an immediate boon for survival for any country wishing to have a future in the West. So, yes, certainly, I do think that the Belt and Road and the Eurasian Economic Alliance, beyond that, as it's spreading also into Africa, South America, does offer a great solution with its not opposing, but with a completely new set of standards of banking, finance, and also geopolitical security that goes with that.
Thank you so much, Matthew Ehret, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Zain.
This was Matthew Ehret, a senior geopolitical analyst. We were discussing the topic of the evolving China-Russia alliance, offering a stability, a hope for the Middle East. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.